The newsagents.
105 days since Rishi Sunak went into number 10. Today he has got to a different sort of milestone. His first proper reshuffle. The first moment where he decides to reshuffle the pack of ministers and move, less charitably, some of the deck chairs around the Titanic. And it's not just a shuffling of the people. This time it is a shuffling of the departments, a so-called machinery of government change. It's very, very exciting for the nerds, of course, Emily. Are you excited?
Yeah, we're trying to work out what it all means. Today on the Newsagents, we're going to tell you who's in, who's out, and the things that haven't changed that you thought perhaps would. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Lewis.
And it's Emily. And we're also going to be joined by James Norton, Tommy Lee Royce, star of Happy Valley. This is your warning. Put this on pause and run and finish the finale if you haven't done yet. But having said that, he's also going to talk to us about wider issues. He's got some advice for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and he talks a little bit about the arts, accents, Yorkshire, and the world more generally.
And you can watch the full interview with James Norton, particularly if you're a Happy Valley fan and you really want to know all of the tiny little details because he was so interesting.
Or if you just want to watch him in vision for half an hour. I mean, not speaking about anyone particularly.
Have you calmed down yet?
No.
Have you calmed down?
You might just want to keep staring at him on the screen for half an hour.
When she came in this morning, listeners, she just said, guess who was sat in this chair last night? I'm sat in his chair.
James Norton chair.
You also sat in the John Sopel chair. You were less excited about that, curiously.
I have to hide that more.
Of course, wisely. We spent too much time together. Should we tell you
about this reshuffle then?
Yeah, I think we should. So this is an exciting day for nerds, for machinery of government watchers. That is the phrase that civil servants use when they're not just talking about a reshuffle, which we're more familiar with, which is a shuffling of the ministerial pack, but when occasionally prime ministers want to show that they've got a grip of the Whitehall machine itself and signpost their priorities in government by literally renaming different departments, reshuffling responsibilities between departments. And so we've got some new departments as well as new ministers to sit in them, or sometimes the old ministers. So we have got, very exciting, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, which inevitably I think will be called, because all of these departments end up with these hideous acronyms, DESNES, DOSAC, yes, alas gone now, DOSAC, but yeah, that will be called DESNES, I suspect. That is Grant Shapps' new department. He was Business Secretary, he's now Energy Security Minister. The Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, DSIT, Michelle Donnellan, who was the Culture Secretary, sat in this very studio. I'm actually sat in the Michelle Donnellan chair, it occurs to me.
You lucky thing,
Lucky
yes.
me. It's a good thing they called it Science, Innovation and Tech rather than Science, Tech and Innovation, because of course then it would have been DSTI, which would have been very nice. There's a nice sort of little story, I don't know if you've ever heard this, from Alan Johnson when he was Trade Secretary, and Blair wanted to create a new department called the Department for Productivity, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And Johnson apparently says to him, well, Tony, I'm very pleased with the job, but we can't possibly call it that. He said, well, why not? He said, well, because the acronym will be penis. and Blair apparently just said, all right, well, what was it called before? And he said, well, it was the DTI, the Department for Trade and Industry. He said, well, let's just call it that again then. So,
I love the blankness. Okay.
Yeah, fine. Whatever. And then we've got BAT, which will be the Department for Business and Trade. That was Kemi Badenoch.
She was International Trade Secretary.
She was International Trade Secretary. She'll now be Business and Trade. And then we've got the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which will be Lucy Fraser, who was the Housing Minister. And that, to be fair, used to be the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. It was then renamed the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports, and is basically reverted. And that's the thing about this, right? It's like, why does a Prime Minister do this? Well, partly they do it, like I say, to try and signal what their priorities are. He obviously really prioritises science and innovation and so on, so he thinks it ought to be its own department. But the thing is that ultimately, when you're talking about like government departments, there are big drawbacks to doing this. The big drawback, if you talk to any civil servants, it takes forever to get this stuff arranged once it's actually been enacted. Even little things like changing the emails, changing the letterheads, arranging exactly when and where different departments and different civil servants are going to be, what offices they're going to be in, when they're going to be rearranged. And the truth is, if you look down this list, many of these departments have actually just existed relatively recently before. So if we take the Department for Energy, the new Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero, we used to have a department which was abolished under Theresa May in 2016 called the Department for Energy and Climate Change. I mean, it's virtually exactly the same thing. We've now got this Department of Science, Innovation and Tech. We used to have a Department for Innovation, Science and Universities. The Department for Business and Trade, we used to have, as I say, the Department for Trade and Industry. It's kind of just fiddling around the edges, rearranging civil servants. It can have benefits in terms of how Whitehall operates and operates more seamlessly and so on, but it's over the very long term. It is not a quick fix, and there is a lot of disruption to civil servants and the machinery of government in the meantime.
Okay, so I would say put all the acronyms to one side and look at what it's telling you, because Rishi Sunak's been in power as Prime Minister for more than 100 days now. And in a sense, this reshuffle is him sort of standing on the parapets and saying, these are my priorities. And I think the top line of this is that he's trying to turn the UK into a science and tech superpower. So if you look at Michelle Donnellan, who comes from culture, she's being, I think I would say, promoted into a place where tech is central. And I wonder if that's his answer to Liz Truss's growth thing. He's saying, I'm not going to crash the markets. I'm not going to start cutting tax. But if you want to actually position the UK in a place where we are competitive, where we're taking on China, where we're taking on big industries in other countries, then we have to put science and technology right at the heart of what we're doing. And it's interesting that she brings with her, I think I'm right in saying, the online harms bill, which used to go under the sort of remit of culture, but will now be seen as the answer to tech. So tech good and bad, if you like, in this new positioning of a department that prioritises technology for the UK. The other one I think it's worth looking at is this new Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, because it has been suggested to me that this is now being seen as a central focus, that if you look at the polling that's coming out, the thing people most care about is the price of their energy. It's kind of up there or just under the NHS. And so this is Rishi Sunak's commitment, if you like, to saying, right, we get this. We can't be Russia dependent. The war's still going on. We need to work to find a way of bringing, cost of living, energy, household bills down. And that's how we're going to do it. The net zero, I think, is interesting because previous prime ministers have kind of shuffled off all the green stuff, the green stuff. Oh, we don't, we're not,
And he got criticism for not going to COP and all that sort of thing.
All that stuff. So maybe this is him kind of putting climate action right back at the top of the agenda. And the last thing I'd say is if you are waiting to see big name sackings, in brackets, Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, that hasn't happened. Maybe you could say that was never going to happen because he's made a lot of due process and there is an investigation, inquiry still ongoing, and nothing will happen to Dominic Raab and those bullying allegations until that is clear. So this has not really been about the culling of big figures as it might have been, in other times.
No, and there is a suggestion that I think you're spot on, Emily, about Sunak wanting to send out the signal that science, technology, innovation is a kind of hallmark of his government, in the same way that perhaps levelling up was the hallmark, I mean, not in policy terms, in honesty, but certainly in terms of the optics of the Johnson government. And there is this interesting suggestion being reported today that perhaps Rishi Sunak wanted Michael Gove to move from levelling up because Gove is considered a very capable minister who's able to really drive forward reform and sell a set of policies to this new science ministry, but that Gove refused because he is so attached to the levelling up agenda and wants to develop it and see it through.
I also think there's something about playing to your strengths. Rishi Sunak never particularly looked like a man that was that happy in the northeast, in the sort of red wall seats, all this stuff. He gets a helicopter to go somewhere that's 40 minutes
away.
Although
he always says, he's a Northern MP and he's very attached to his constituency.
He's a Richmond MP, fair enough. I wonder whether he's also kind of saying, you're going to call me a globalist? Sod it. I'm going to embrace the whole kind of, globalisation thing. Science and technology is something he understands. We've talked about his background in Goldman Sachs, the sort of slight management consultancy air about him. I think it sort of suits him to say, this is what I'm about. I'm not going to pretend I'm anything different. This is what I do well.
I mean, what we also can say about this reshuffle is that, as I say, it causes dislocation within Whitehall. And when you can already look at, recent departmental mergings and so on, A civil servant was telling me earlier today that, the government still hasn't really sorted out the merging between the Foreign Office and the Development Office. Civil servants still don't have their proper emails, they still don't have proper access to different departmental buildings and so on. So it does cause chaos. But you can also see more evidence of the total ministerial churn that we've seen over the last few years, right? So if you take this this defunct Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, back to just Culture, Media and Sport, like I say, that was only in existence since 2017. It's had 7 secretaries of state in that time. We've now had, and will have now, 9 culture secretaries in the last 8 years. And we're going to have, because Lucy Fraser, who's now joined the cabinet, she was our housing and planning minister. We're now going to be on our 12th housing and planning minister since 2016. I mean, that is crazy. I mean, we wonder why we can't get planning reform accomplished in this country. We wonder why we've got a housing problem. It's not the only problem. There are lots of other structural reasons. But when you've got deep structural problems like you have with housing in this country, the constant ministerial churn, and which has been accelerating, not slowing down, is a really, really big problem.
I was talking to somebody about one of the culture department's briefs, which is, this whole question over the Parthenon marbles and whether they'll be loaned or returned or exchanged, with Greece. And this person, who was quite a keen, proponent of seeing them in Greece, was saying to me, I'm not going to spend too much time thinking about what the culture secretary says, because who knows, they might change.
Totally.
Sure enough,
as they have
3
done.
days later, the whole thing's up in the air, and we don't know what Lucy Fraser thinks about that. Apparently, I'm hearing she's not particularly a risk taker. She gets on top of her brief. She's very thorough, very smart. I don't know what her position is going to be on a lot of the big issues that we kind of raise fairly often on this podcast.
Well, Lucy Fraser is a really good example of it, right? She's well thought of by number 10. Sunakite in a way in terms of her style and approach to politics. But just in terms of her career since September. On the 7th of September, she was Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Then until the 26th of October, she was Minister of State for Transport. Then she was Minister of State for Housing and Planning until today. And now she's Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. That's 4 jobs since October. I mean, as I say, it's a perfect microcosm of why, ministers aren't able to really get any kind of grip over their brief when they're just constantly being turned around. We used to talk about this being a problem like them being moved every 18 months to 2 years. Now they're lucky, some of them, to get 2 months or 3 months into the job. I suppose the other thing we should just talk about briefly is Greg Hands, who has replaced, in a way, this was the genesis of this whole thing, right, is the fact that Zahawi had to go, and he's used it as an opportunity to conduct a slightly bigger reshuffle than he might already. Greg Hands, who's the MP for Chelsea and Fulham, previously a trade minister, has now gone to become Conservative Party chair. And he has a really unenviable task, because in less than 3 months, we are going to be faced with the local elections, big set of local elections, and the big first electoral test for the Sunak premiership, coming after the first big election since Johnson went, since Truss went, energy prices, etc., etc. And that is going to be, as you talk to people in Westminster, there is more and more agreement that the fallout from those elections and the results, and everyone expects them to be bad, just depending on how bad they are, it's going to be a very critical few days for the Sunak premiership, and whether or not he is able to contain that fallout, if they are as bad or worse than people are now expecting. And Hands is going to have a key role in trying to mitigate that.
And I'm sure Greg Hands is a very able minister, but you do want to be the fly on the wall, and maybe, who knows, we will get a fly on the wall in a day or so, who'll tell us how many people turned that job down for precisely those reasons before it went to Greg Hands. Because if you've got a government department where you can actually tangibly see the difference you're making, and the alternative is being thrown out and told to rally the crowds and knock on doors and sell whatever's happening right now on the doorstep, that's a task that I'm imagining one or two might have already said a firm no to.
Tory party is losing donors, it's losing money, it's losing activists, it's losing enthusiasm. That is a really, really difficult hand to play as a Conservative Party chairman, going into a local election campaign, and then, of course, preparing for the big one, the general election campaign, which will almost certainly happen next year.
Well, somebody else who's got a little bit of advice for Rishi Sunak was James Norton, the actor. Don't know if we mentioned him at all earlier in the
Don't start
podcast.
again.
Yeah. He talks to us about the ending of Happy Valley. So this is your warning that we will be talking about the ending of the whole season, the whole series, the whole thing, and what it felt like to be working on that. And he talks about what it was like to be in the middle of that, what it was like to go home or almost home for him, a Yorkshire boy, to Happy Valley, and what he thinks about arts funding and the way the government is handling all that right now. Coming up. Welcome back. Right, we warned you yesterday. This is Spoiler City Central. We brook no complaints from people who haven't watched the Happy Valley finale by now. You had Sunday night, you've had the whole of Monday, no work, you've had Monday night, and it's now Tuesday. And we are talking to James Norton, Tommy Lee Royce. My God, how lovely to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Has it been a weird day, a sort of day after day?
It has been a bit strange. It's been a bit overwhelming. It's a bit like, I'm trying to think what it feels like, and it feels a bit like Christmas Day, where you have all the sort of the fun and excitement, but then there's also this sort of slight pressure. I should be savouring this. It's this moment, and of course it's quite abstract because nothing really changes. It's just lots of lovely articles, but it is lovely, and it's really, it is very special. What am I saying? It's very special to be at the centre of something which is kind of unique and quite massive.
Did you film a lot of endings?
No, that's complete nonsense.
Really?
I can put that to bed now. That was the media taking something which was said completely out of context. I think what happened was Amit Shah, who played Faisal, said that, and I'm not sure if it was in the final cut, but I think they shot his final scene in lots of different ways, different sort of interpretations, which was then misconstrued, and then there was this rumour that we'd shot hundreds of different vendors, which would have been a hugely wasteful and impractical way of shooting. You're already desperately playing against the clock, and so the idea of having days to shoot alternate endings is nonsense.
And the intensity of that final scene, of that kitchen scene, I thought it was astounding. He must have been it's exhausting enough, doing this podcast with Emily at the end of the day, without the level of intensity of our relationship, let alone that you and Sarah Lancashire. It was astonishing.
Yeah, it was a cool day. You have good directors and good sets, well-run sets, which create a kind of theatre atmosphere, and the centre of this kind of crazy hive of activity is the space in which you act, and all the lights and the cameras and the costumes and makeup, all of it's exhibited, all the people's work are exhibited in that little space. And sometimes it's completely chaotic and there's noise and chaos around you, and occasionally it's this sacred space where you kind of go and it's quiet, like a library or a sort of church. And this day it was mad because everyone had already, most people, I think everyone had watched the show, the first two series. Everyone knew that this day was very special. No one knew what was going to happen because they only gave the scripts to Sarah and myself and the producers who needed to know. So everyone was really excited to see what happened. And the crew, the cast, it was just, everyone was walking around in whispers. The energy was palpable. It was crackling. And Sarah and I think we knew the pressure on us, but often you thrive in that kind of environment. And she is I could say so many platitudes about her. She's genuinely very, very special and brilliant.
Did I read somewhere that wasn't, that house is now become iconic, but the scene that final kitchen scene where you end up burning to death, that wasn't actually that house.
No, the art department did an amazing job. They built the whole kitchen in a studio, so we were in a soundstage.
That's astonishing. You would never have known.
Yeah, and they had gone to such detail. You walked in and you would never have known. We would never have known. The scratches on the kitchen table, the markings on the fridge, everything, every single detail. What that meant was we could burn the place down. We didn't end up burning the place down, but of course, understandably, the owners of the actual house probably weren't that happy about us coming in. So what happens is you've got literally a fire engine there. There were two fire engines outside. You've got firemen in their kit ready to put the stunt man who is, I wish I could remember his name, incredibly brave. He was wearing a suit and they lit him alight. It was nuts.
So at what point do you swap? You take the match or the lighter?
It's not seamless.
Yeah.
You do it in stages. So I lit myself and then I screamed a lot, which apparently is not right. Apparently if you burn to death you don't scream, which is something I heard afterwards. Anyway,
Fortunately, relatively few of us have seen it, so
true.
You can't really compare.
Picking up my own performance. But there was a shot which we had like flaming kind of gas in front of me, which gave the impression that I was inflamed, and then the big bit at the end of the day was him stepping up and literally lighting himself on fire, which is incredibly brave.
Did you watch that? Were you riveted?
Yeah.
Were you worried for him?
Yeah, and he has that kind of a safe word where he's like, get me out, because he feels the heat beginning to touch his skin, and at one point he had to use the safe word. But there's a team of people with these incredible industrial...
That could have put a bit of a downer on the end of production, couldn't it?
It really could have.
So what was the safe word?
I can't remember.
Secret,
I can't remember. Maybe it was a tap or something. I mean, it's very, very well choreographed. The whole thing is, you can imagine the safety precautions are like insane.
Let me ask you about that final scene, right? Do you think that Tommy is redeemed at the end? Because the thing that really surprised me, I think, like watching it, I think like a lot of people, I was expecting a bit a la the end of series 1, some sort of massive confrontation, and he's in his house, and you're sort of, I suppose how clever it is that you're kind of led, even within the episode, to think that, because he's broken into her house and so on, and you think, this is going to be it. And yet they end up having this almost deeply intense, but also kind of weirdly understated kind of conversation, in which he offers her forgiveness, which really winds her up. But in a weird sort of way, it struck me that he was kind of redeemed at the end, in a sense. I mean,
this is the kind of truth that I've been living with, which Sally put in place in the first series. I mean, the woman is a genius. She deserves every, piece of praise and accolade that she's getting right now, because she genuinely is, unto her own kind of league of writer. She put all this in place in the first series, and in episode 5, I think it was, Tommy's in a tower block and he's been stabbed. And up until that point, he's been much more of the kind of classic stock psychopath villain. And then he starts crying and says, I could have been something, me. I had the opportunity. He knows that he had potential and he lost it. And he sort of has this moment of self-reflection. And a psychopath wouldn't... I don't think... He at that moment, he showed such tenderness and humanity. And he says, I have a boy. And he suddenly discovers what it is to love. And that was all sort of plotted in the first series. So... And then, of course, there's another scene in the first series where Catherine says, you raped my daughter. And he says... I didn't rape her. What are you talking about? We had a thing going on. We were in a relationship. So in Tommy's head, he has had this lovely relationship with Becky. They've given birth to this beautiful boy, and it's Catherine who's taken the boy away from him, never told the boy that he had a father and stuff. So in Tommy's head, he has he's desperate to destroy that woman. It's not a case of psychopath taking kind of bloodlust. It's actually,
But he sets his son alight, or threatens to, in the second series. I mean, that's the point she keeps coming back to. There is an inconsistency, isn't there, between Tommy's relationship with Ryan and whether any part of it is caring or it's all destructive.
But isn't that the beauty again of her writing, is that it was ultimately an act of love? I mean, we had this amazing, the BBC were fantastic on this show. They put me in touch with this guy called Costas, a criminal psychologist, and I sat with him for a few hours, and we talked about Tommy, and we worked, he kind of described to me the world Tommy lives in, and ultimately he has been so badly abused that the world is inherently aggressive, and it's a dog-eat-dog world. If you don't fight first and attack first, you'll get attacked. And it's a very sad outlook that it's such a despicable place to live. But at the end of the day, he thinks, why do I want this one little boy who I love so much to live the same life I've led? He said, we're going to go together, we're going to go away together, it's going to be so much better. We're going to die together, and that's ultimately an act of love. I'm going to take you away from this horrendous world. And I think that's, I mean, it's a little Is
it complicated though? Because on one level, we've also seen him do horrendous things, right? I mean, he's a rapist. He, is deeply misogynistic. He's horrendous in a lot of ways. And yet, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing against the nuance. It's fascinating, but there is a bit of sort of tension there. Do you think he developed over the series?
There is, and look, there's no denying that he's done despicable things, I'm desperate to make. I'm very, very aware that the sexual violence, particularly, and there is something, particularly in his treatment of Anne Gallagher in that first series, which is unnecessarily violent, but. Pretty much all the other things, but parking that for a second, the killing of Kirsten McCaskill, she was the police officer, it's all necessary. The killing of Lewis, the guy, they're all acts of survival. He was hired to kidnap Anne, so there's an argument that, again, he was doing it in a kind of sort of perfunctory act. But I agree, there's no condoning the despicable act.
Can we talk about the stereotype of the sexy psychopath? Because that's another thing, isn't it? That, women write to psychopaths and they come and visit them and they fall in love. Were you aware, as a good-looking man, that you might be sort of, reinforcing this idea of the sexy psychopath?
I mean, you are aware of it to a certain extent. Tommy's very vain, and there's a lot of scenes where he's checking himself in the mirror and he takes care of his image. And I think the hairstyles was a nod.
He sort of becomes Jesus.
He becomes Jesus. Yeah, he definitely looks like Jesus.
I'm on blasphemous territory at this point, aren't I? I'm trying to row back. I'm not saying that psychopaths are sexy. I'm saying there was a sexuality in
also
how
the
you
interesting
played Tommy,
opposite of
which is a
Catherine
kind
as
of
well.
weird thing.
Yeah,
because Catherine doesn't care about her appearance, by contrast.
Sure. That's true. I think that there is something inherently sexy about the psychopath anyway. It's this, subversive, dark shadow that people are attracted to and just fascinated by it, aside from all kind of sexualizing it. But yeah, I mean, Tommy is a young, kind of fit, vain man who takes care of himself. He's got some very choice tattoos, but he's not there in prison kind of taking drugs and getting kind of wasting away. He's in there like Cape Fear doing kind of press ups and so yeah, I think I don't know whether or not there's two strands to that, I guess. One is the fact that we are obsessed with psychopaths just generally, and then Sally did want to make Tommy this confusing thing, I think, and I think it just nods to why it is that we are drawn to these people, and it just makes the whole thing much more complicated. I mean, people's reactions to Tommy was often confusion. They were like, why do I want to take him out on a date, and then now I want to give him a hug? And again, it's...
And have you had that in real life now? I mean, if you walk down the street, do you get people yelling abuse or...
I did at the beginning.
Well,
no, I got at the beginning. I got a few people kind of shouting abuse, or not abuse, but like, you're a monster, and then it was all kind of tongue in cheek. And then I did get the slightly weirder thing, which was young women on social media saying, like, I said it a couple of times in interviews, but take me to your cellar, which is disconcerting, especially when Sally's doing so much for in order to redefine the way sexual violence is portrayed on television. I mean, the amazing thing about the first series, if you remember, was there was no rapes ever. There was nothing actually ever shown. It was just inferred by a pair of underwear on the floor, or it was talked about afterwards in very kind of understated and it was handled incredibly elegantly. And I think there is often, previous to that, there was often this kind of bodice ripping culture where the sort of sexual violence towards women was gratuitous and titillating, and Sally denied the audience that in a really admirable way. But at the same time, she did make Tommy this sort of attractive man, and I think that was in order to make, just to confuse the audience, which I think it successfully did. She loves to give you a sense of a character, allow you to build preconceptions, and then rip the carpet from underneath your, So Tommy his overall arc was psychopath, stock villain, antagonist, and then turns into ultimately abused victim, and that's the classic sort of Sally signature. She just likes to mess with your heads.
But in a way, he's able to forgive in a way that Catherine isn't.
But I think Catherine does, doesn't she? I mean, well, the first thing is she says, maybe not forgive. She definitely doesn't want to rip him apart, and all those endless moments where she's like, I'm going to rip his skeleton out of his mouth, and these quite violent images of what she's going to do to Tommy. And then the first thing she says is, I'm going to call you an ambulance, and she turns into this quite maternal, caring figure. I don't think she's never going to be able to forgive Tommy for what he did to Becky, because their truths are completely poles apart. He thinks that they had a loving relationship and had a child. She thinks that Tommy raped her daughter and was responsible for her death. So there's no way in which she'll ever forgive him. But there is a tenderness towards the end where I think that the arc of her journey with Tommy and Ryan is she was desperately afraid that Ryan was going to turn into Tommy because Tommy is a psychopath. And then she discovers that Ryan hasn't turned into Tommy and is actually a really beautiful young boy, a prince, and he's been surrounded by love, and the nurture nature debate has sided very much with the nurture, and he's fine. And then the final realization, I hope, is that Tommy isn't a psychopath, and that this has been this constant question, is he a psychopath? And I think Sally's overall message is that he wasn't, and that he was just incredibly abused,
let down
and sad. Let down. He had a very sad and unfortunate lot.
The setting is key, isn't it, to Happy Valley? I mean, not just the title, but just the dialogue feels that it couldn't be said in any other accent but the Yorkshire accent, West Yorkshire accent. And you're How local are you to that part of the world? Pretty born and bred?
Born London, but then moved when I was 3 to a place about half an hour north of York, and then stayed there until I was 18 and then came south. My family is still there. My sister has moved back with her 2 kids, and my mum and dad have stayed there. They've been there for 40 years or whatever, 35 years. So I feel very much like a Yorkshireman. And
we've got to be careful because you're a North Yorkshire
North
man.
East Riding.
Right.
I got told off for that.
Exactly. And West Yorkshire's is it feels very different, right?
Different accents. Yeah.
So were you an outsider when you went to? Did you film in Halifax?
We filmed in Halifax and Hebden Bridge. I don't think so. I think Yorkshire people in general, I think they're a clan and a tribe, and they're very proud. I mean, of course, there's probably like occasional. I got told off by a few people for saying I was a Yorkshireman. I grew up in the area, and I didn't. I grew up in East Riding, not the West Riding, because obviously Yorkshire's the biggest county in the country. It's vast, but generally, I think there's a sort of shared temperament, which I definitely was familiar with. You know, there's lines where she's like, "What are you having for tea?" Yeah. Stew. Heaven.
My favourite.
Heaven.
That'll be all right.
And
I'll be all right. That one. What did she say?
Yeah, I'll be all right. It'll be all right. It's stew, you know. and I, when I was at school, went to a local state school. My mum and dad worked later, and so I'd go to this lovely lady called Liz Marshall's house, and we'd have tea at 6 o'clock every night, and we'd have a bit of meat with gravy, and then at the end of the day, we'd slap a bit of white bread in the gravy, and we'd have always a bit of extra gravy, and we'd have an apple pie with a slice of cheese. I mean, all these like incredible, the sacred act of having tea and cups of tea.
Every other line in the show is like, "Do you want some tea?" Tea, yeah. I mean, it's like that's the theme.
Did you mash tea? That's the question. Did you got mashing tea?
What's that?
You mash a pot.
Oh, is that right? Oh,
yeah,
gosh.
you mash a pot.
Are you from Yorkshire?
Yeah.
Okay,
but not West Yorkshire.
Okay, clearly.
With the famous Yorkshire woman Emily Maitlis. She always comes in the morning. All right, Chuck, how are you doing?
I've got to say, the end of just the wonderful part of that scene is that there we are. The heart of Happy Valley, I've always thought, is the cups of tea between Catherine and Siobhan. Sarah and Siobhan, and
Claire, the sister.
Claire and Catherine, yeah. And they just sit and have cups of tea, and they talk about the world, and they make jokes, and they're tender and compassionate and cruel and bitchy, and it's just lovely. And there's Tommy at the end, and ultimately that's what I was going to say about Sally is, everyone thought that it was going to have this huge Hollywood ending. The number of predictions I read, both from friends, articles, hundreds of people having all these different ideas of how it was going to end. No one got it right. No one said Tommy will take his own life and they'll have almost a sort of moment of reconciliation. And it was over a table where ultimately the heart of Happy Valley existed. Cups of tea, domestic, quiet, understated. That's where this big fireworks happened. No one predicted
no guns, no car chase.
No guns, no car chase. And that's Sally. That's where she's the genius. She somehow manages to nail what is inherently unpredictable, and yet when you've watched it, you're like, oh, that was the only ending that could have been. That was the most realistic of all the endings, even though no one predicted it. It's magic. She's sort of genius in that way.
Is that because a woman in charge of the dialogue and the scripting, or would you not go that far?
I mean,
does it feel like it could only be written by a woman?
This particular show has had an incredible team of women around it from the very beginning. Karen Lewis and Nicola Schindler, who produced the first 2 series, and then Faye's with Look At Point, and then Jess Taylor, who was a makeup artist in the first series. Sally thought she was so good that she promoted her to producer, and then you've got Sally, Sarah, Siobhan. I mean, there is something obviously at the heart of this, which is it's a woman's story. I loved how I read it somewhere that none of the male stories were shown, none of the conclusions were shown on film. Faisal, Mark Stanley's character, even Tommy, it was all talked about. They were all charged, arrested, died, texted.
Text.
Yeah, none of the men got to finish their story on camera. It was all sort of talked about, and that's not that it wasn't a man's story, but I think there's something about Sally and yeah, I say that. It's a women's story at heart. It's Catherine's story.
And it's a working class story.
It's a working class story, yeah. But she writes everyone, class, gender. She's not just nailing Catherine's voice. It is a woman's voice at the heart of it, but she nailed Tommy. She nails Ryan and Cisco when they're walking through the playground, who are 16-year-old boys. It's insane. I mean, Siobhan Finneran said something which I think is really astute, which is that, and it's really simple, but it's that Sally writes the way people speak, and no one else can do that. And it's a weird, very simple skill, but it's true. She doesn't just write one person in the way they speak. She writes every single character in perfect clarity. And when you're reading it as an actor, it's joyful because you don't have to do any work. You just flow with it, let it, trust it.
But all the male characters, I mean, they're all, apart from probably Tommy, they're all quite weak, right? I mean, isn't that because such emphasis has been put rightly on the kind of strong, multifaceted women?
Yeah.
But every series has got basically a weak, vacillating man at the centre of it. There isn't really, it seems to me, a strong male character in it, like as in especially strong, notably strong, other than perhaps Tommy himself. I mean, maybe he's got other sort of weaknesses in lots of different ways, but he's a very strident figure.
Yeah, he carries sort of power, a certain type of power.
He's the only one with power, it seems to me.
But then, I guess...
Is that just notable because we're not used to seeing a series centred and anchored on women, or is it sort of...
I mean, we've seen so many stories, plays, novels where the male narrative is at its centre and you have these female characters facilitating that journey. So I guess Sally has upended that. And I think if you asked her that, she'd be like, no, it was totally unconscious. But I'm sure there is a bit of that. I mean, all of her stories, Gentleman Jack, I think Last Tango, I'm not so familiar with that. But they're all driven...
you mean you haven't yet watched that? She'd be furious to hear that, wouldn't she?
I will, of course I'm going to go.
I'm going to go and watch it now too.
But yeah, same. Isn't Ryan, though, the strong one? Isn't Ryan at the end?
He is quite strong.
You know, Ryan ultimately...
So Ryan is about hope, right?
Yeah.
And he is the kind of... he could be anything. Yeah, he could have grown up to be a rapist like his dad. He might now be a policewoman like his grandmother, a policeman like his grandmother. If he's now looking if he's looking at James Norton and saying, could I, Ryan, be like the next James Norton? Like, is there the possibility, do you think, for those kids to be entering that world?
You mean
in the arts,
Ryan
in Britain
or
now?
Ryan or Reese the actor?
No, I'm
right.
sure
Ryan's
that,
Ryan the character wanting to...
Let's stay in character, but in the sense that where we are in Britain right now, with access to the arts, could Ryan, could he grow up the child of rape?
I mean, there's two questions, lots of questions, aren't there? There's one which is the nurture-nature question, the child of rape, and I think that's answered in the show because Catherine so successfully absolves him of that, not absolves him in the sense of forgiveness, but she extracts him from that trauma and protects him from potential harm that could have been inflicted on him. And at the end, he makes the right choice. He makes the ethical choice, the moral choice. He betrays his dad for the greater good, and that's a incredibly brave and strong act ultimately, because it's his last remaining parent. They are growing a relationship of love, and he does it. So I think in that sense, she is the perfect example of how a child of rape can, within the right context, the right world, the right house and family, and surround them with love and support, can grow out of that. That wonderful line at the end when she says, when the cop says, it's fine. There's two grandmothers and a grandfather. The young daughters, is it Poppy or Polly, doesn't take her coat off. The girls are going to be fine. I had never seen the show until last night, so some of the storylines I'm unfamiliar with. The other question is, I guess, a class question about whether or not this country has an infrastructure in place to allow kids like Ryan and Reese, the actor who plays him, access into the arts. And it's an ongoing conversation, and fantastic writers like Sally are taking shows like Happy Valley to Halifax and casting people like Reese, and he's done so well, and he hadn't come from an acting background, and he's now so focused and auditioning, and I know that their family quite well now, and so but
so
obviously,
what was
but that's an anomaly.
What was his story? He was a school kid that she gave a part to in a
I don't know if it was an open audition, or I don't know how, but he hadn't acted before. I mean, the kid, he didn't really know what was going on in those first two series. It was completely on instinct. I think it's interesting what's going on with moving Arts Council funding out of London, and I think it's well intentioned, but I don't necessarily think it does the arts a good thing overall. I mean, if you deny institutions like the Donmar and the Hampstead Theatre its Arts Council funding in order to take it outside, I understand in theory why, but if you don't support those centres of excellence, it doesn't nurture young writers, and then we don't have this trickle down effect, and we don't remain the kind of the one of these amazing focal.
So how do you then open the arts? How do you open the arts to the Ryans, to the Reeses, to people that might look and say, I can't get into that world. I wasn't brought up going to the theatre. I wasn't brought up reading plays or books. I kind of think I want to be James Norton.
Well, first thing you do is you don't follow Rishi Sunak's advice and make everyone take maths through to A-level, and you nurture arts and humanities all the way through school and allow kids to take on courses which aren't necessarily as practical and vocational. And so that's the most important thing is school, I guess, making sure that they are supported, and there's outreach programs from centres of excellence in London and other big cities, and they get out to those schools and they introduce kids to theatre at an early age, and so that there's an awareness. And then it's youth theatres, and I mean, I was so lucky. I grew up in North Yorkshire, and every summer holidays I did a youth theatre. It was called Livewire, and it was great. I went to Stephen Joseph Theatre in Scarborough for a work experience one summer, and so there was stuff there, and I think it's about finding it and just making sure that kids know it's there, and I think that's a lot to do.
Is there enough arts in the schools?
I haven't been in the schools enough recently to answer that, and I know that often friends who are teachers, it's often the first, particularly at universities, it's the first courses to get cut. So I think that that we need to be very, very careful, because also this country's got such a cultural heritage, and to waste that, talk about our standing on the world stage right now. I mean, the way shows like Happy Valley they travel over to America, it's amazing. I feel so proud when I go over there and random people come up to me on the street and talk to me about Hebden Bridge, as a sort of,
hey James,
yeah,
Hebden Bridge is great.
And they love it. I mean, I have no idea what you're saying.
They wanted to audition Lewis.
Well, it's only a matter of time.
Very,
of course.
very good.
They watch it on with subtitles on, but they love it, and it's an amazing advert for this country. So I think we need to keep nurturing the arts.
James, where are you on that debate that is dominating around culture and theatre at the moment about actors playing characters that are in some way attuned to their lived experience? There's all this discussion about whether a straight actor can play a gay character, and that sort of vein. I mean, obviously you were playing a very, very working class character. Arguably, it's an old phrase, the underclass. Tommy is probably associated with that. I mean, is that something you thought about or reckoned with when you were playing him? Or perhaps, I mean, this is quite a new debate in some ways, so maybe even since the first series started, it's something that sort of occurred to you or you thought about.
I think it's a conversation which we have quite a lot, and I think it takes thought, and one has to handle it delicately in certain situations. And I think there are certain roles which are clearly can only be played by someone who lives that experience, and that's absolutely unquestionable. And then there are other roles and other types of role which I think there is there's a more fluid sort of potential. And so someone like Tommy, I guess you could argue that you need to find a Yorkshireman first and foremost, and then possibly someone who...
A West Yorkshire.
West Yorkshire, sorry, I keep doing
Jesus, you just keep on cramming onto their territory. It's just not nice.
Sorry, I apologise to all those West Yorkshiremen out there and women. I mean, you could go on and say, well, then surely we need to find someone who's had, some extreme trauma as a child. I mean, look,
we need to find a rapist.
We need to find a rapist. I mean, at what point do you draw the line?
You're an actor.
And you're an actor. And also actors loved going on those transformative journeys. And often if you play people who aren't close to yourself, it can aid the performance sometimes. I mean, if you play people who are always the same as you, I think often you don't make as brave choices. I think if you're given the opportunity to go on that transformative journey, as long as it's not at the expense of someone else, someone who's more deserving or who will do it better than you, I think if you can prove to people that you're up for it, you'll do the work, that's really important, that you'll actually go and honour that role you're doing and put the work in. And if you do a good job, then I think as long as it's done committedly and compassionately, and the casting process is done in a compassionate way, and it has made sure that it's open to everyone, then I think that's a slightly wafty answer, but
no, I hear you. Exactly.
We love that. That's what podcasts are about.
Yeah.
James, listen, before you go, because the Telegraph has decreed that you have passed your Bond audition with flying colours. We're not going to ask you about James Bond.
Aren't we?
Well, no, we're not.
Okay, you're going to play James Bond.
I can play James Bond. No, we're going to ask you, if you were playing James Bond, what would be your sort of Bond direction of travel? What would be the Bond that you think needs to happen?
From Yorkshire, of course, obviously.
Yorkshire
Is
Bond.
that not a Bond?
Halifax
question?
Bond.
Oh, no, God, we
the
wouldn't
most-
be that trite, no.
That's
007.
Elegant,
the
I
most
think you'd call
elegant,
it,
yeah, oblique way of talking about Bond. What would my Bond be? I mean, I don't know. I don't envy them that discussion. I wonder what the conversations are going on when they're saying we're going to reinvent the whole franchise. But I don't envy that kind of task.
Because you don't think Bond can be improved?
No, I just think you're playing. You're gonna, it's that classic thing where you are going to offend a lot of people. Whatever you do, it's a poison chalice. There's no right answer because so many people are going to be so upset because it's.
But would
such
you be
a big
like
franchise.
a rugged Bond or an intellectual Bond
Oh,
or
I
a
see.
suave Bond or a...
I'd be.
Do you want to play Bond, James? That's what she's basically saying. Do you want to play Bond?
I don't know. I mean, I genuinely talk about the abstract experience of being in the middle of this sort of wild experience of Happy Valley. It's the Bond thing is even more abstract. It's like so hard to compute, and as a result, I don't spend much as people might think. I don't spend hours of my day imagining myself as Bond or what the life would be.
If you were one of our political guests, we would say, "Do you rule it out?" Do you rule out playing James Bond? And then we can take it to paper and say, he doesn't rule it out, does he?
What would your very sort of not I was about to say slimy? What do the political
Freudian slip of it?
Our political guests.
No.
on the show.
I was about to say
They'd
what
say
would
never say never.
what would the more and it was the wrong choice of word, but what would the kind of what
I'll
was
tell you what they'd
was-
say. They'd say,
what is the out?
I felt there was a duty
Okay.
to accept what the nation needed and play
If drafted,
Bond.
I will serve.
I'd feel that it was a sense of moral obligation on behalf of the nation. Do you feel that
Actually,
moral
what you just
obligation?
did was better.
Was it better? No, I don't feel a moral obligation. I don't think that anyone is going to say that I took the unethical choice. If I have to, I'm just going to waffle. I'm going to be as
Did you see what he
bumbling
did?
as
He
I
just
possibly
sidestepped
can.
that. It was magnificent. It was better than any political
Brilliant.
guest we've
It's
ever had.
fantastic, yeah.
What would you suggest, I would say? Magnificent.
James Norton, thank you.
My pleasure. This
Thank
really
you
was
Very much.
fun.
It
Thank
was
you.
really fun.
Thanks.
So that was James Norton proving just what a good secret agent he would in fact be by giving virtually nothing away. Do you think give anything away? Do you think he's going to be Bond?
I think he's definitely going to be Bond.
Do you?
No. I've no idea. He wouldn't say, would he?
No.
Unbelievable. He'd be a good Bond, don't you think?
He'd be a great Bond.
Be a great Bond. He's got our endorsement, and frankly, that's all that matters.
I think at this point that's all that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, talking about casting, we have had a little bit of news today, haven't we? About one of the very own newsagents.
Well, if you're talking about me, I have known about this for quite a long time.
Oh, you just thought so you didn't break your own news line? You could have broken it here.
Oh, my line.
If you haven't seen this is the news. This is the this is obviously the not remotely ego-inflating news for Ms. Emily Maitlis that one Gillian Anderson, latterly playing other great luminaries and great British political figures such as Margaret Thatcher, is going to be playing you in an upcoming Netflix series.
So I'm really worried about your hormones now, Lewis, because I know how fond of Margaret Thatcher you are.
Emily, it's such a joy that we will be played by the same actress. No. Do you think she'll be channeling Thatcher? A little bit of bit of you.
One of our lovely listeners has written in to say, in Newsagents the movie,
Oh yes.
who plays Lewis and who plays John. So let's
Is
start.
a young Gregory Peck available for me? I suppose he's not around.
Oh, that's good.
yeah. Sir Alec Guinness, the late Sir Alec Guinness for John, of course.
So Gregory Peck, you just want to be Atticus Finch, don't you?
Yeah, basically. Failing that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what about a young John Pertwee? I'd quite like to play me. You look at me completely blankly.
I
aren't you?
can't
Played the
think who
Third
that is.
Doctor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he wore a lot of great velvet jackets. Be quite
Right,
into
we've
that.
gone straight on to you. What about Sopel?
Well, I told you, sort of Alec Guinness, sort of like Timothy Spall,
Do you know what? This
Bill
is what
Oddie.
happens. Okay.
Bill Oddie.
So
Someone
if you're
like that?
listening to this is what happens when you become the Bondi
What about
Beach
John Voight?
correspondent.
John
Come
Voight.
back.
John Voight could play him.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Then I could do. Dustin Hoffman could play me. We could do a version of Midnight Cowboy. That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't think we're ever going to get John back at this point. That's all from us.
Hi, John. Bye, John.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.